Chapter 9, Section 2, New Inventions and Technologies. Edison was one of thousands of ingenious inventors, mechanics, and scientists working to create new products and machines in the late 1800s. Thanks in part to their work, American life changed dramatically. The United States evolved from a largely agricultural nation into a complex industrial society. This shift brought modern conveniences to many consumers. In 1865, Americans still lived in the horse and buggy era. They lit their homes with candles or oil lamps, they kept fresh foods in an icebox, a cabinet cooled by a large block of ice, and they waited a month or more for letters to cross the country. By 1900, many Americans illuminated their homes with electric lights. They kept foods cold in an electric refrigerator. They could send news across a continent in an instant by telegraph or telephone. A few could even afford to replace their horse and buggy with a new automobile. Americans invest in new technology. These innovations captured the imagination of investors who are willing to finance or fund the development of new products. Without this financial backing, many inventions would never have reached the market. Some would never have been built at all. This willingness to risk money on new businesses lies at the heart of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which factories, equipment, and other means of production are privately owned rather than being controlled by government. Capitalists in the late 1800s provided the funds to build railroads and factories and furnished them with machinery and supplies. They put money into new technology and scientific research. In return for risking their money, they hoped to reap rewards if the new business proved profitable. Edison, for example, received generous financial support from a group of capitalists led by the wealthy banker J.P. Morgan. Together they formed the Edison Electric Light Company. In 1880 alone, this group provided the inventor with $150,000. In return, Edison gave the company the rights to his lighting inventions for a 5-year period. The investors helped Edison pursue his vision, and they profited handsomely as a result. Financial backers often protected their investments by making sure inventors acquired patents. A patent gives an inventor the sole legal right to make or sell an invention for a specified period of time. The federal government began issuing patents in 1790. By 1860, only 36,000 had been granted. Between 1860 and 1900, the number skyrocketed to more than 600,000. Edison holds a record for patents issued to one person, with 1,093 in all. Revolutionary changes in communication and transportation. The use of electricity had brought dramatic progress in communications even before the Civil War. Artist and inventor Samuel F.B. Morse created the first practical telegraph by 1837. To send messages by electric signal, he used a dot and dash system later known as Morse code. In 1843, Morse set up an experimental telegraph line linking Washington, D.C. with Baltimore, Maryland. He opened this line to commercial use the following year. Telegraph lines soon crisscrossed the countryside, mainly following railroad tracks. The railroads relied on the telegraph to keep track of their trains. Newspapers also used the telegraph to gather information and send stories to local newspapers. Several companies established telegraph networks. By the 1870s, however, the Western Union's Telegraph Company dominated the industry. By 1900, nearly 1 million miles of telegraph wires were carrying more than 60 million messages a year. The next revolution in communications came with the telephone. For nearly 12 years, the inventor Alexander Graham Bell had pursued the idea of sending speech over wires. He finally succeeded on March 10, 1876. According to popular legend, the first telephone message was a result of an emergency, with Bell calling out to his lab assistant Watson after accidentally spilling acid. However, in a letter to his father, Bell made no mention of any accident. I was in one room at the transmitting instrument, and Mr. Watson at the receiving instrument in another room, out of earshot. I called out into the transmitting instrument, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." And he came. He said he'd heard each word perfectly. I feel that I have at last struck the solution of a great problem, and the day is coming when telegraph wires will be laid onto houses just like water or gas, and friends converse with each other without leaving home. Bell's invention attracted plenty of financial support. In 1877, he founded the Bell Telephone Company. That same year, the first commercial telephone line was strung in Boston, where Bell lived. By 1893, more than 250,000 phones were in use. That year, Bell's patent ran out, allowing others to profit from his invention. Independent telephone companies formed across the country, helping create a surge in home use of the new technology. By 1920, the number of telephones had grown to at least 13 million. Two other inventions changed how Americans moved. The first, the automobile, came to the United States from Europe. The second, the airplane, was homegrown. In 1903, the brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright made the first successful powered airplane flights in history near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. After that first success, inventors worked continually to improve airplane design. Rock oil provides a new source of fuel. The development of new fuels gave rise to another new industry. Before the Civil War, lamps mainly burned whale oil, which was very expensive. In the mid-1800s, Canadian scientists discovered how to refine crude oil that seeped out of the ground into a lamp oil called kerosene. But the supply of surface oil was limited. Then a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake made an important discovery. In 1858, Drake went to Titusville, Pennsylvania, on business. He had bought stock in a Pennsylvania rock oil company which gathered surface oil for use in medicine. While in Titusville, Drake studied the techniques of drilling salt wells. Drake decided to lease land from the company for oil drilling. In August 1859, after several weeks of drilling, he struck oil. Countless more wells were drilled, in Pennsylvania and 13 other states. Oil drilling and refining became a huge industry, supplying fuel for lamps, lubricating oils for machinery, and later, gasoline for automobiles. The Bessemer process revolutionizes steelmaking. A new technology for turning iron into steel gave rise to another major industry. Iron is a useful metal, but it is brittle and fairly soft. Steel is a purified form of iron mixed with carbon. Engineers prefer steel for most purposes because it is harder, stronger, and lighter than iron. Before the 1850s, however, the process for making steel out of iron was time-consuming and expensive. In 1855, a British inventor named Henry Bessemer patented a new method of making steel. The Bessemer process involved blowing air through molten iron. The blast of air removed impurities. Using this process, steel could be produced far more cheaply and quickly than in the past. After seeing the process at work in England, Andrew Carnegie decided to invest heavily in steel production in the United States. In 1873, he began to form the Carnegie Steel Company, which later put the largest and most modern steel mill of its time near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. As the steel industry grew, steel became the metal of choice for heavy construction. Railroads switched to steel rails, builders began using steel to construct longer bridges and taller buildings. In 1883, the longest suspension bridge in the world opened. This towering structure, the Brooklyn Bridge, stretched for 6,700 feet across the East River in New York City. 2 years later, builders erected the world's first skyscraper, a 10-story building in downtown Chicago. Neither of these structures would have been built without the use of steel. Electricity lights up America. A single invention can have far-reaching effects. Edison's light bulb, for example, gave birth to the electric power industry. In 1882, Edison built a central generating station in New York City. Its wiring electrified a section of lower Manhattan. Before long, the demand for electricity became too great for the Edison Electric Light Company to meet on its own. Throughout the country, other companies built their own central generating stations to meet the customers' needs. By 1891, there were more than 1,300 stations providing enough electricity to power about 3 million light bulbs. Access to electricity had a huge impact on American industry. Artificial light allowed businesses to stay open longer. Factories could run through the night. Electricity changed home life too. Americans could not only work and read at night, but also plug in electric refrigerators and other appliances. Electricity was costly at first, though, and power companies built stations mainly in the cities. Many Americans, especially in rural areas, had to wait decades more for electric transmission lines to reach them.